I'm Captain Sarah Mitchell, 29, and during what should have been a peaceful flight to my sister's wedding, she spent 2 hours loudly mocking my military career to her fiancé while I sat in the row behind them in coach. What she didn't know was that both pilots had just suffered severe food poisoning, and in 15 minutes, I would be the only person on Flight 847 with the skills to land a Boeing 737 carrying 300 passengers through a Category 4 hurricane. When the flight attendant asked if anyone had pilot experience, my sister's face went white, as she realized the failure she'd been humiliating was about to become the only thing standing between everyone on board and certain death. Think you can predict how family dynamics change at 30,000 feet during a crisis? Hit that like button if you believe heroes aren't always who you expect. Subscribe for more incredible family drama stories. And let's dive into how sometimes the person your family looks down on becomes the one who saves their life. Growing up as the older daughter in a family of high-achieving academics and professionals meant constantly feeling like I'd disappointed everyone by choosing a path that didn't align with their intellectual values and social expectations. My parents, Dr. Robert Mitchell and Professor Catherine Mitchell, had built their lives around prestigious university positions and scholarly achievements that brought them recognition in elite academic circles. My younger sister Emma had followed perfectly in their footsteps, earning a PhD in molecular biology by age 26 and accepting a research position at a prestigious medical school where her work on cancer therapeutics was already attracting international attention. She was everything our parents had hoped both their daughters would become: brilliant, accomplished, and moving in social circles that reflected well on the family's intellectual status. I, on the other hand, had joined the Air Force at 18, immediately after high school, pursuing a military career that my parents viewed as a disappointing waste of my intellectual potential. While Emma was earning academic honors and publishing research papers, I was completing flight training, learning combat aviation, and working my way up through the ranks of military aviation. Sarah could have been anything she wanted, my mother would tell family friends, usually when I was present to hear the conversation. She had excellent grades, strong test scores, and real academic potential. It's unfortunate that she chose such a limiting career path instead of pursuing higher education. The phrase limiting career path was their polite way of expressing disappointment that I'd chosen military service over the university education they valued so highly. In their academic world, success was measured by degrees earned, papers published, and prestigious institutional affiliations. My achievements as a combat pilot didn't register as real accomplishments in their intellectual framework. Family gatherings had become increasingly uncomfortable over the years as Emma's career flourished while mine was dismissed or ignored. During holiday dinners, conversations focused extensively on Emma's research breakthroughs, conference presentations, and professional recognition, while my military service was acknowledged with brief, polite questions before discussions returned to topics the family found more interesting. Emma's work on cellular regeneration could revolutionize cancer treatment, my father would announce proudly to gathered relatives. She's being invited to present her findings at major medical conferences around the world. Meanwhile, my promotion to captain, my completion of advanced fighter pilot training, and my deployment experience were treated as mildly interesting, but not particularly impressive achievements that didn't warrant extended family discussion. The disparity in their reactions became more painful during my most recent leave, when I tried to share news about being selected for the elite Thunder Angels demonstration squadron, an honor that represented the pinnacle of military aviation achievement, and was awarded to fewer than 12 pilots nationwide each year. "That's nice, dear," my mother had responded, her attention clearly focused on Emma's engagement announcement and wedding planning details. "I'm sure you'll enjoy the travel opportunities that come with that assignment." She'd treated my selection for one of the most competitive positions in military aviation like a casual hobby rather than recognition of exceptional skill and years of dedicated training. The family dynamic that had been uncomfortable but manageable during my 20s became actively hostile as Emma's wedding approached. She'd gotten engaged to Dr. Marcus Webb, a fellow researcher whose family moved in the same academic circles as ours, creating a union that perfectly aligned with our parents' values and social aspirations. The wedding planning became an extended celebration of everything our parents valued: intellectual achievement, social status, and professional prestige, while serving as a constant reminder of how completely I'd failed to meet their expectations for my life choices. Emma and Marcus represent the kind of partnership we always hoped our daughters would find, my father said during one wedding planning dinner. Two brilliant minds working together to advance human knowledge and make meaningful contributions to society. The implication that my military service didn't constitute meaningful contributions to society was clear, though never stated directly. In their academic worldview, fighting for national security was less valuable than laboratory research, and military leadership was less impressive than scholarly publication. But the most painful aspect of Emma's wedding preparations was discovering how thoroughly she'd absorbed our parents' dismissive attitude toward my career and achievements. During conversations about wedding logistics, she'd begun making casual comments that revealed she viewed my military service as embarrassing rather than honorable. "I hope Sarah doesn't wear her uniform to the ceremony," she'd mentioned to our mother during a discussion about appropriate wedding attire. "It would look so out of place with all the academic professionals who'll be attending. I'd prefer if she dressed like a normal person for once." The suggestion that my military uniform made me look like something other than a normal person was crushing, especially coming from a sister I'd always supported and celebrated despite our different career paths. The flight to her wedding was supposed to be an opportunity for family bonding before the big celebration, but it became another painful reminder of how little my family valued the skills and achievements that had defined my adult life. What none of them understood was that the military training they dismissed as limiting had actually prepared me for situations that their academic achievements couldn't begin to address. The flight to Emma's wedding destination in Miami was supposed to be a routine 3-hour journey that would give our family time to settle in before the rehearsal dinner. Instead, it became a public humiliation session where Emma spent the first 2 hours of the flight loudly discussing my career failures with her fiancé Marcus while I sat directly behind them, forced to listen to every cruel word. "I just don't understand how someone with Sarah's test scores and academic potential ended up in the military," Emma said to Marcus, her voice carrying clearly through the thin airplane seats. "My parents spent so much money on her education, and she threw it all away to play with airplanes instead of pursuing something meaningful." Marcus's response was equally dismissive. "Some people are just drawn to simpler career paths that don't require sustained intellectual effort. Military service provides structure for people who can't handle the independence and complexity of academic or professional work." The conversation was taking place at normal speaking volume, but on a crowded airplane, their words were clearly audible to passengers in the surrounding rows, including me. Emma knew I could hear every word she was saying, which made her casual cruelty even more painful and deliberate. "The worst part," Emma continued, "is how she acts like being a pilot is some kind of prestigious career. It's basically just following instructions and pushing buttons. Any reasonably intelligent person could learn to fly a plane if they wanted to waste their time on something so pointless." Her reduction of military aviation to following instructions and pushing buttons revealed how completely she misunderstood the complexity, skill, and responsibility required for combat flying and aircraft command. But her dismissive attitude reflected the broader family view that my career was a disappointing waste of intellectual capacity. "Sarah could have been a doctor, a researcher, a professor," Emma said, warming to her favorite topic of my wasted potential. Instead, she chose to spend her 20s playing Top Gun fantasies while the rest of us built real careers that actually contribute to society. Marcus laughed at her reference to Top Gun, clearly enjoying the opportunity to participate in mocking my career choices. "Does she do that thing where military people expect to be thanked for their service? That must be awkward at faculty parties and academic conferences." The suggestion that expecting basic respect for military service was somehow embarrassing or inappropriate was particularly cruel, especially coming from family members who'd never shown any appreciation for the sacrifices required by military life. But Emma wasn't finished with her public humiliation campaign. She'd saved her most vicious comments for the topic that she knew would hurt me most: my personal relationships and social life. The saddest part is watching Sarah try to date civilian men who have no idea what to do with someone whose entire identity is built around military service, she said, her voice carrying the kind of mock sympathy that made her cruelty even more painful. She's approaching 30 with no serious relationships, no real career prospects outside the military, and no backup plan for what she'll do when she's too old to keep playing fighter pilot. The attack on my personal life was devastating because it targeted insecurities I'd been struggling with privately. Military life did make dating challenging, especially when potential partners shared Emma's dismissive attitude toward military service as a legitimate career choice. "Marcus, you should be grateful you found someone like me instead of ending up with a woman whose idea of professional achievement is learning to land on aircraft carriers," Emma continued, apparently enjoying the laughter she was generating from her fiancé and the passengers, who could overhear their conversation. The mockery of carrier landing, one of the most challenging and dangerous skills in all of aviation, requiring split-second timing and absolute precision in conditions that would terrify most civilian pilots, showed how little Emma understood about the technical demands of my work. But the conversation took an even more personal turn when Emma began sharing private family discussions about my career with Marcus and anyone else who could hear their conversation. "My parents are so disappointed about Sarah's choices," she said, lowering her voice slightly, but not enough to prevent me from hearing every word. "They invested so much in her education and had such high hopes for her future. Now they have to explain to their colleagues why their older daughter chose military service instead of pursuing graduate school or professional training." The revelation that my parents discussed their disappointment in me with Emma, and that she felt comfortable sharing those private family conversations with her fiancé in public, was heartbreaking and infuriating simultaneously. "They are hoping she'll eventually come to her senses and use her military experience to transition into something more respectable," Emma continued. "Maybe commercial aviation or aerospace engineering. Something that uses her technical skills, but doesn't involve all the military culture nonsense." The phrase military culture nonsense perfectly captured Emma's contempt for the values, traditions, and professional relationships that had shaped my adult life and provided meaning and purpose beyond anything I'd found in civilian pursuits. For 2 hours, I listened to my sister systematically demolish my career, my personal life, and my value as a family member, while passengers around us alternated between discomfort at witnessing such public cruelty and amusement at her clever put-downs of military service. I was considering asking to change seats or finding some way to escape the continuing humiliation when the flight attendant's voice came over the intercom with an announcement that would change everything for everyone on Flight 847. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a medical emergency in the cockpit and need to make an emergency landing as soon as possible. If there are any licensed pilots on board, please press your call button immediately." The airplane went completely silent. Emma's mocking laughter stopped mid-sentence. Marcus looked confused and scared. Passengers throughout the cabin were beginning to understand that our flight was in serious trouble. And I was the only person on board who could save us. The silence that followed the flight attendant's announcement was complete and terrifying. 300 passengers and crew members were suddenly confronting the reality that our aircraft was in serious trouble, and everyone was looking around the cabin to see if anyone would respond to the desperate request for pilot assistance. I pressed my call button immediately. Within seconds, the chief flight attendant, Maria Santos, was at my seat, her professional composure barely masking the panic in her eyes. "Are you a pilot?" she asked quietly, clearly hoping to avoid creating more passenger anxiety while dealing with our emergency situation. "I'm Captain Sarah Mitchell, United States Air Force," I replied, keeping my voice calm and authoritative. "I'm a fighter pilot with over 2,000 hours of flight time, including experience with large aircraft systems." "What's the situation in the cockpit?" Emma's face had gone completely white. She was staring at me with an expression that mixed disbelief, embarrassment, and growing terror, as she realized that the sister she'd spent 2 hours mocking as a failure might be the only person who could save her life. "Both pilots are incapacitated with severe food poisoning," Maria explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "They became violently ill about 20 minutes ago, and Captain Rodriguez collapsed at the controls. We've been trying to revive them, but they are unable to perform their duties." The situation was even worse than I'd initially understood. We weren't dealing with a single pilot emergency, we had complete cockpit incapacitation on a commercial aircraft carrying 300 people, flying through increasingly severe weather conditions, as we approached the Miami area. "How long until our scheduled landing?" I asked, already calculating the variables and challenges we'd be facing. "We were supposed to land in 45 minutes, Maria replied, "but we are dealing with severe thunderstorms around Miami International, and air traffic control was already discussing potential delays and holding patterns." The weather complications meant we weren't just dealing with an emergency landing, we'd be attempting to land a large commercial aircraft through dangerous storm conditions with limited fuel and no margin for error. "I need to get to the cockpit immediately," I said, unfastening my seatbelt and standing up. "Have you contacted air traffic control about our situation?" "We are in contact with ATC and company operations," Maria confirmed as we moved toward the front of the aircraft. "They are clearing emergency landing priority for us, but the weather conditions are making everything more complicated." As we walked toward the cockpit, I could hear passengers throughout the cabin beginning to understand the severity of our situation. Conversations were becoming more anxious, children were starting to cry, and the overall energy in the cabin was shifting toward panic. But my focus was entirely on the technical challenges ahead. Landing a Boeing 737-800 wasn't the same as flying an F-16, but the fundamental principles of aviation, aircraft systems, and emergency procedures were transferable. More importantly, my military training had prepared me for high-stress situations where lives depended on split-second decision-making and flawless execution under pressure. The cockpit was chaos when I arrived. Captain Rodriguez was slumped over the controls, conscious but barely functional due to severe nausea and weakness. First Officer Thompson was attempting to maintain aircraft control while fighting his own symptoms of food poisoning. "Captain, I'm Sarah Mitchell, Air Force pilot," I announced as I entered the cockpit. "I'm here to assist with flying the aircraft while you recover." Captain Rodriguez looked up with obvious relief. "Captain, I can barely see straight, and Thompson is in worse shape than I am. We need help immediately." "What's our current situation?" I asked, quickly scanning the instrument panel and getting oriented to the Boeing 737's cockpit layout. "We are at 32,000 feet, 200 miles northeast of Miami International," Thompson managed to say between waves of nausea. "Fuel is adequate for normal landing, but we are dealing with severe thunderstorms across our approach path. ATC is working on routing us around the worst weather." I took the right seat and began familiarizing myself with the 737's control systems, flight management computer, and navigation displays. While the aircraft was different from military jets I was accustomed to flying, the basic principles of aircraft control, navigation, and emergency procedures were identical. "I'll take control of the aircraft," I announced, placing my hands on the controls and feeling the familiar sensation of flying by instruments and managing complex aircraft systems under pressure. "Captain Rodriguez, if you can stay conscious, I'll need your guidance on 737 specific procedures and landing configurations." The next 30 minutes would test every skill I'd developed during 10 years of military aviation training and experience. We were dealing with severe weather, unfamiliar aircraft systems, and the lives of 300 people who were counting on my ability to safely land an aircraft I'd never flown before. But the most immediate challenge was the passenger cabin, where panic was beginning to spread as people realized our aircraft was being flown by someone other than the original flight crew. "Captain Mitchell," Maria's voice came through the cockpit intercom, "passengers are becoming very anxious, and some are asking questions about who's flying the plane. How should I handle their concerns?" "Tell them the truth," I replied while making navigational adjustments to avoid the worst storm cells. "We have an experienced military pilot assisting the flight crew with our emergency landing, and everyone should remain calm and follow all crew instructions." But I knew the real test wasn't managing passenger anxiety or navigating around thunderstorms. The real test was going to be the actual landing, which would require precision flying skills and perfect execution under conditions that would challenge even the most experienced commercial pilots. And I was about to attempt it while my sister watched from the cabin, finally understanding that the failure she'd been mocking for 2 hours was the only thing standing between everyone on board and disaster. The Boeing 737's controls felt different from any military aircraft I'd flown, but the fundamental physics of aviation remained the same. As I settled into the pilot's seat and began managing our emergency descent toward Miami, muscle memory from thousands of hours of flight training took over, allowing me to focus on the complex challenges ahead rather than the unfamiliar cockpit layout. "Miami approach, this is Flight 847 declaring emergency," I transmitted on the radio, my voice carrying the calm authority that military training had ingrained in me during countless crisis simulations. "We have pilot incapacitation and are being assisted by military pilot. Request priority handling and vectors around weather for emergency landing." "Flight 847, Miami approach copies emergency," came the immediate reply. "We have you on radar and are clearing traffic. Severe thunderstorms are affecting all approach paths to Miami International. Can you accept vectors to Fort Lauderdale where conditions are slightly better?" The decision between airports wasn't just about weather. It was about fuel calculations, emergency services availability, and runway specifications that would affect our landing options. Captain Rodriguez, despite his illness, was able to provide crucial information about aircraft performance and fuel remaining. "We have enough fuel for Fort Lauderdale plus 30 minutes reserve," he managed to say between waves of nausea. "Runways there are long enough for emergency landing, and their emergency services are excellent. Miami approach, Flight 847 accepts diversion to Fort Lauderdale," I transmitted, already beginning the navigation changes required for our new destination. "We'll need emergency equipment standing by and medical assistance for our flight crew." As we began our descent through increasingly turbulent conditions, I could hear the anxiety level in the passenger cabin rising dramatically. The turbulence from the thunderstorms was severe enough to make even experienced travelers nervous, and our emergency situation was making everything more frightening for people who were already scared about our pilot situation. "Captain Mitchell," Maria's voice came through the intercom again, "passengers are asking more specific questions about who's flying the plane. Some are concerned about having a military pilot instead of a commercial pilot handling the landing." The irony was perfect. Passengers were worried about my qualifications to fly their aircraft, while my sister, who'd spent 2 hours mocking those same qualifications, was sitting in the cabin finally understanding that her life depended on skills she'd been dismissing as worthless. "Maria, you can tell passengers that I have over 2,000 hours of military flight time, including experience with aircraft much more challenging to fly than commercial airliners," I replied while configuring the aircraft for our approach to Fort Lauderdale. "Military pilots are trained to handle emergency situations that civilian pilots rarely encounter. But passenger anxiety was the least of my concerns. The real challenge was managing our approach through weather conditions that were testing the limits of what any pilot should attempt. Lightning was visible in all directions, wind shear was creating dangerous turbulence, and heavy rain was reducing visibility to barely acceptable levels. "Captain, the weather at Fort Lauderdale is marginal for landing," First Officer Thompson said, his voice weak, but still professional despite his illness. "Winds are gusting to 45 knots with frequent direction changes. This is going to be a very challenging approach." The wind conditions meant we'd be dealing with severe crosswinds during our landing attempt, requiring constant control adjustments and split-second reactions to maintain aircraft stability. It was exactly the kind of precision flying that military training had prepared me for, but it would be terrifying for passengers and crew who weren't accustomed to aggressive aircraft handling. "I can handle the crosswind landing," I assured the flight crew, drawing on experience from countless military training scenarios involving adverse weather conditions and challenging airports. Military pilots practice crosswind landings in conditions that civilian aviation would cancel flights for. As we descended through 10,000 feet, I made the announcement that passengers had been dreading, confirmation that we were indeed in an emergency situation being handled by someone other than their original flight crew. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Sarah Mitchell," I announced over the passenger address system, my voice carrying the calm confidence that comes from extensive experience managing crisis situations. "I'm a United States Air Force pilot who's assisting your flight crew during a medical emergency." The cabin went completely silent. Every passenger was listening intently to understand exactly who was controlling their fate. "I have over 10 years of military flying experience and more than 2,000 hours of flight time in various aircraft," I continued. "We are making an emergency landing at Fort Lauderdale International Airport, where weather conditions are challenging but manageable. Please remain seated, ensure your seatbelts are fastened, and follow all crew instructions. We are going to experience significant turbulence during our approach due to thunderstorm activity in the area," I concluded. "This is normal for the weather conditions we are flying through, and I want everyone to understand that we are fully capable of landing safely despite the rough conditions." After ending the announcement, I could hear the immediate reaction from the passenger cabin through the cockpit door. Some passengers sounded relieved to know that someone experienced was controlling the aircraft. Others seemed more anxious about having a military pilot instead of a commercial pilot managing their emergency. But the reaction I was most curious about was Emma's. For 2 hours, she'd been publicly mocking my military career and aviation skills. Now she was learning that those same skills were the only thing standing between her and potential disaster. "Captain Mitchell," Maria's voice came through the intercom one more time, "there's a passenger who says she's your sister and wants to apologize for something. Should I allow her to come to the cockpit?" "Absolutely not," I replied firmly, focused entirely on managing our approach through increasingly dangerous weather conditions. "No passengers in the cockpit during emergency operations. She can talk to me after we are safely on the ground." The next 20 minutes would be the most challenging flying of my career, requiring every skill I'd developed through military training while managing an aircraft I'd never flown before in weather conditions that would test the limits of even the most experienced pilots. But for the first time in years, I knew with absolute certainty that my family would never again question whether my military training had been worth the investment. The approach to Fort Lauderdale International Airport was unlike anything I'd experienced in military aviation. While fighter jets are designed for aggressive maneuvering and rapid responses, the Boeing 737 was a massive, less responsive aircraft that required different techniques for managing crosswinds and turbulence during our emergency landing attempt. Fort Lauderdale Tower, Flight 847 is 15 miles out for emergency landing, I transmitted as we descended through severe turbulence and driving rain. Be advised we have pilot incapacitation and military pilot assistance. Request emergency equipment standing by. Flight 847, Fort Lauderdale Tower, emergency equipment is rolling, came the immediate response. Runway 10 right is cleared for your approach. Winds are 0-90 at 38 knots, gusting to 52 knots. Previous aircraft reported severe wind shear on final approach. The wind conditions were extreme. Crosswinds strong enough to push our large aircraft sideways during landing, with gusts powerful enough to suddenly change our approach path and aircraft attitude. It would require constant control inputs and split-second corrections to maintain proper alignment with the runway. Captain Rodriguez, despite his illness, remained conscious and provided crucial guidance about the 737's landing configuration and emergency procedures. Captain Mitchell, you'll need to approach at higher than normal speed due to the wind conditions, he managed to say. The aircraft will want to weather vane into the crosswind, so you'll need aggressive rudder inputs to maintain runway alignment. I was already making the mental calculations required for crosswind landing techniques. The physics were identical to military aviation. Use aileron input to prevent drift, rudder input to align the nose with runway centerline, and be prepared for aggressive control movements during the critical seconds of touchdown and rollout. Cabin crew, prepare for landing, I announced over the intercom. This will be a rough approach due to weather conditions. Ensure all passengers are secured and brace positions are understood. Through the cockpit door, I could hear flight attendants giving emergency landing instructions to increasingly anxious passengers. The turbulence was severe enough that people were having difficulty remaining in their seats, and the constant lightning flashes outside the windows were making everyone aware of how dangerous our weather conditions had become. At 5 miles out, we encountered the most severe wind shear I'd ever experienced in any aircraft. The Boeing 737 was suddenly pushed 200 feet below our intended approach path, while simultaneously being shoved sideways by wind gusts that felt like invisible hands trying to flip our aircraft. Wind shear, I called out, adding full power and pulling back on the controls to arrest our descent and regain proper approach angle. The engines responded with a roar that passengers had probably never heard during normal commercial flights, and our aircraft shook violently as we fought through the dangerous air currents. Captain, that was the worst shear I've felt in 20 years of flying, First Officer Thompson said, his voice reflecting both his illness and his amazement at the conditions we were battling. But military training had prepared me for exactly these situations. Fighter pilots routinely train for emergency landings in adverse weather, engine failures during critical flight phases, and aircraft control in conditions that would ground civilian aviation. The techniques were identical: maintain aircraft control at all costs, compensate for environmental factors, and execute procedures with precision despite external pressures. 2 miles out, runway in sight, I announced as Fort Lauderdale's runway lights became visible through the rain and lightning. The sight of our destination was reassuring, but the most challenging part of our emergency was still ahead. Commercial aircraft landings require delicate finesse during the final approach and touchdown. Unlike military jets that are designed to slam onto aircraft carriers or short runways, the Boeing 737 needed to be gently placed on the runway despite the crosswinds that were trying to push us sideways. 1 mile final, configuring for landing, I transmitted to air traffic control while lowering landing gear and adjusting flaps for our final approach configuration. The aircraft's handling characteristics changed significantly with gear and flaps extended, requiring constant trim adjustments and control inputs to maintain proper approach speed and angle. The crosswind was pushing us sideways toward the runway, requiring a technique called crabbing, pointing the aircraft's nose into the wind while flying sideways toward the runway centerline. At the moment of touchdown, I would need to straighten the aircraft's alignment while simultaneously managing the landing flare and ensuring our main wheels contacted the runway properly. 500 feet, runway aligned, I called out, beginning the most critical phase of our emergency landing. Through the cockpit windows, I could see emergency vehicles lined up along the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, and rescue equipment all positioned for worst-case scenarios. The final 500 feet of approach required continuous control adjustments, as wind gusts alternately pushed us high and low, left and right of our intended approach path. My hands were moving constantly on the controls, making dozens of small corrections each second to keep our massive aircraft properly positioned for landing. 200 feet, on target, Captain Rodriguez announced, his professional training overcoming his illness, as he monitored our approach progress, and called out critical altitude milestones. At 100 feet above the runway, we encountered the most severe crosswind gust of our entire approach. The Boeing 737 was suddenly pushed 30 feet to the right of runway centerline, while simultaneously being lifted by rising air currents that tried to balloon us above our proper approach path. This was the moment that would determine whether 300 people survived our emergency landing or whether we'd become another aviation accident statistic. Everything I'd learned during 10 years of military flying, emergency procedures, aircraft control under stress, precision maneuvering in adverse conditions, was being tested simultaneously during the most critical seconds of our flight. I applied full left aileron to counter the drift, while using aggressive rudder inputs to align our nose with the runway centerline. The aircraft responded with the heavy, delayed reactions typical of large commercial jets, requiring anticipation and smooth control inputs rather than the immediate responses I was accustomed to in fighter aircraft. 50 feet, centerline, I called out as our aircraft settled onto the proper approach path for touchdown. The landing itself required split-second timing and perfect coordination between multiple control inputs. At the moment our main wheels contacted the runway, I had to straighten our aircraft alignment while simultaneously managing the landing flare and preparing for maximum braking and reverse thrust to stop our aircraft on the wet runway. The touchdown was firm but controlled, exactly what was needed for our challenging conditions. Our tires made contact with Fort Lauderdale's runway at exactly the right point and angle, and our aircraft immediately began decelerating as I applied maximum braking and reverse thrust. "We're down," Captain Rodriguez announced with obvious relief, as our Boeing 737 rolled out on the runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles and safely on the ground after one of the most challenging approaches any of us had ever experienced. The passenger cabin erupted in applause and cheering. 300 people, who'd been facing potential disaster, were suddenly celebrating their survival and the successful conclusion of an emergency that could have ended very differently. But the most satisfying moment was knowing that Emma had witnessed every second of our emergency landing, finally understanding that the military training she'd been mocking for 2 hours had just saved her life and the lives of everyone else on board Flight 847. The moments immediately following our emergency landing were a blow of activity as emergency responders boarded the aircraft, medical personnel attended to the incapacitated flight crew, and passengers began processing the reality that they'd just survived a potentially catastrophic situation through the skills of a military pilot they'd barely known was on board. Captain Rodriguez was the first to acknowledge what had just happened. Despite his illness, he managed to turn to me with genuine gratitude and professional respect. "Captain Mitchell, that was extraordinary flying under impossible conditions. You saved every life on this aircraft tonight." First Officer Thompson, though still weak from food poisoning, echoed his captain's assessment. "I've been flying commercially for 15 years, and I've never seen aircraft handling like what you just demonstrated. That crosswind landing was textbook perfect under conditions that should have been impossible." But the real recognition came from the passengers themselves, as they began deplaning and realized who had been controlling their aircraft during the most terrifying flight of their lives. The same people, who might have questioned having a military pilot instead of a commercial pilot, were now lining up to thank me for saving their lives. "Captain Mitchell," said an elderly gentleman who'd been sitting in first class, "I'm a retired airline pilot myself, and I want you to know that was the most skilled emergency flying I've ever witnessed." You handled that aircraft like you'd been flying 737s your entire career. A mother traveling with 2 young children approached with tears in her eyes. My kids were so scared during the storm, but when you made that announcement and told us you were a military pilot, I knew we were going to be okay. Thank you for bringing us home safely. The comments continued as passengers filed past, business travelers, families, elderly couples, all expressing gratitude for skills they were only now understanding had been essential to their survival. But the encounter I was most interested in was still coming. Emma had been conspicuously quiet since our landing, and I could see her waiting near the gate as other passengers expressed their thanks and moved on to collect their baggage. When the crowd had thinned and most passengers had left the gate area, Emma finally approached me. Her face showed a complex mixture of emotions, embarrassment, gratitude, and what appeared to be genuine shame about her behavior during the flight. Sarah, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I need to apologize for everything I said on the plane. I had no idea. I mean, I never understood. What you never understood, I replied calmly, is that military training prepares people for exactly the kind of emergency we just experienced. While you were mocking my career, as following instructions and pushing buttons, I was drawing on 10 years of experience managing life or death situations under pressure. Emma's face flushed with embarrassment as she realized I'd heard every cruel word she'd said during the first part of our flight. Sarah, I'm so sorry. I was wrong about everything, your career, your skills, your value to our family. You literally saved my life tonight, and I'd spent the entire flight treating you like a failure. Emma, this isn't just about tonight, I continued. This is about years of family conversations where my military service has been dismissed, my achievements have been minimized, and my career has been treated as a disappointment compared to your academic success. The conversation was drawing the attention of other passengers and airline personnel who were still in the gate area, but I didn't care about privacy. Emma had been comfortable mocking me publicly, she could handle being held accountable publicly as well. You told Marcus that being a pilot was basically following instructions and pushing buttons, I said, my voice carrying enough volume that nearby people could hear our conversation. You suggested that military service was for people who couldn't handle the independence and complexity of academic work. You mocked my career as Top Gun fantasies while real careers contributed to society. Emma was crying now, clearly overwhelmed by the magnitude of her misjudgment and the public nature of our confrontation. But I wasn't finished addressing the broader family dynamics that had led to her cruel behavior. This attitude doesn't come from nowhere, I continued. You've absorbed Mom and Dad's disappointment about my career choices, and you felt comfortable expressing their private criticisms because you knew they agreed with your assessment of my life decisions. Sarah, please, I know I was wrong, Emma pleaded. I'll talk to Mom and Dad about their attitude toward your career. I'll make sure they understand how incredible your skills are and how proud they should be of your achievements. But the most important recognition came from an unexpected source. A man in an airline uniform approached our conversation with obvious authority and professional bearing. Excuse me, Captain Mitchell, he said. I'm Captain James Rivera, Chief Pilot for the airline. I wanted to personally thank you for your exceptional handling of our emergency situation and discuss some opportunities that might interest you. Excuse me, Captain Mitchell, he said. I'm Captain James Rivera, Chief Pilot for the airline. I wanted to personally thank you for your exceptional handling of our emergency situation and discuss some opportunities that might interest you. The offer that followed was beyond anything I'd expected from our emergency landing. The airline was interested in fast-tracking me through their commercial pilot training program, offering a direct path to captain position based on the skills I'd demonstrated during our emergency. Captain Mitchell, what you accomplished tonight was extraordinary, Captain Rivera explained. Emergency landings in those where the conditions challenge even our most experienced pilots, and you executed it flawlessly in an aircraft you'd never flown before. We'd be honored to have someone with your skills and experience join our flight operations. The recognition from a major airline's chief pilot was professionally significant, but the personal validation was even more meaningful. After years of family members dismissing my military career as limiting and unimpressive, I was receiving recognition for exactly the skills they'd been unable to appreciate. "I'm honored by the offer," I replied, "but I'm committed to completing my military service." However, it's encouraging to know that airlines value the training and experience that military aviation provides. Captain Rivera nodded with understanding. "Absolutely, and please know that our offer remains open whenever you're ready to transition to civilian aviation." Tonight proved that military pilots bring capabilities that civilian training simply can't replicate. As Captain Rivera departed, Emma stood witnessing yet another validation of the career she'd been mocking just hours earlier. The sister she'd described as having no real career prospects outside the military was being recruited by major airlines based on skills she'd dismissed as worthless. "Sarah," Emma said quietly after Captain Rivera had left, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you recognition for achievements I was too ignorant to understand and too cruel to respect." "Emma, the problem isn't just your ignorance about military aviation," I replied. "The problem is a family dynamic where your academic success has been celebrated while my military achievements have been dismissed. Tonight shouldn't be required for family members to recognize that different career paths can be equally valuable." The conversation was interrupted by Marcus, who approached with obvious nervousness about facing the person whose skills had saved his life after he'd participated in mocking her career. "Captain Mitchell," he said formally, "I need to apologize for my comments during the flight. I was completely wrong about military service and aviation skills. What you did tonight was incredible, and I'm grateful and ashamed simultaneously." "Marcus, you participated in a conversation that reduced 10 years of military training to following instructions and pushing buttons," I replied. "You suggested that military service was for people who couldn't handle intellectual complexity. Those comments reveal fundamental misunderstanding about what military aviation requires." "I understand that now," he replied. "I had no idea that military pilots dealt with situations this complex, or that the training was so comprehensive. I'm embarrassed about my ignorance and grateful for your skills." The apologies were appropriate, but they couldn't undo years of family conversations where my career had been treated as a disappointment compared to Emma's academic achievements. The real test would be whether tonight's experience translated into lasting changes in how my family viewed military service and my professional accomplishments. As we gathered our belongings and prepared to leave the airport, I realized that our emergency landing had fundamentally changed family dynamics in ways that would extend far beyond Emma's wedding celebration. "Sarah," Emma said as we walked toward baggage claim, "I want Mom and Dad to hear directly from me about what happened tonight and how wrong we've all been about your career. They need to understand that we've been dismissing achievements we should have been celebrating." "Emma, this isn't just about tonight," I replied. "This is about recognizing that different types of intelligence and different career paths can be equally valuable. Military service develops capabilities that academic training doesn't provide, just like academic training develops capabilities that military service doesn't provide." The wedding celebration that followed would be different from what anyone had planned. Instead of being the family disappointment attending my successful sister's triumph, I was now the hero who'd saved 300 lives through skills that my family was finally beginning to understand and appreciate. But the most important outcome wasn't family recognition, it was the knowledge that when 300 people needed someone with the skills to handle an impossible situation, I had been exactly the person they needed, prepared by exactly the training my family had dismissed as limiting and unimpressive. Emma's wedding 3 days later was unlike any family gathering we'd ever experienced. Instead of being the marginalized sister whose career choices disappointed everyone, I found myself at the center of conversations where family members, wedding guests, and Emma's academic colleagues wanted to hear about military aviation and the emergency landing that had already become local news. The story of Flight 847's emergency landing had been picked up by regional media, with particular focus on the military pilot who'd successfully landed a commercial aircraft through severe weather conditions. Several news outlets had requested interviews, and the airport had provided official recognition for my role in preventing what could have been a major aviation disaster. "Sarah, we saw the news coverage about your emergency landing," my aunt said during the rehearsal dinner. "We had no idea that military pilots received training for situations like that. It sounds incredibly complex and challenging." The recognition from extended family members who'd never shown interest in my military career was gratifying, but the more significant change was in my parents' behavior and attitude toward my professional achievements. "Sarah, we owe you an apology," my father said during a quiet moment when we could speak privately. "We've spent years treating your military service as a disappointment, when we should have been recognizing it as an extraordinary achievement that requires capabilities we never understood." My mother's acknowledgement was even more comprehensive. "Honey, watching the news coverage and hearing from other passengers about your emergency landing made us realize how completely we've misjudged your career and your skills. We are proud of you in ways we should have been expressing for years." The apologies were meaningful, but the real test would be whether their changed attitudes would persist beyond the immediate drama of our emergency landing and translate into lasting respect for military service and different types of professional achievement. Emma's behavior throughout the wedding weekend demonstrated the most dramatic transformation. Instead of treating my military career as an embarrassment that detracted from her celebration, she was actively highlighting my achievements and expressing genuine pride in having a sister whose skills had saved lives. "I want everyone to meet my sister Sarah," she said during her wedding reception speech, "who is a United States Air Force captain and the pilot who saved Flight 847 3 days ago. I'm ashamed that it took a life-threatening emergency for me to recognize how extraordinary her career and capabilities are." The public acknowledgement during her wedding reception was powerful, but the private conversations we had during the weekend were even more significant for rebuilding our relationship. "Sarah, I want you to know that Marcus and I have been talking extensively about military service and the misconceptions we had about aviation careers," she said during one of our conversations. "We are both interested in learning more about what your training involves and how military experience translates to civilian applications. Emma, I appreciate your interest, but what's most important is recognizing that different career paths require different types of intelligence and preparation," I replied. "Academic achievement and military service both have value, just in different ways." The wedding guests' reactions provided additional perspective on how civilian professionals viewed military aviation once they understood the complexity and responsibility it involved. "Captain Mitchell, I'm Dr. Peterson from the medical school where Emma works," said one of her colleagues. "I wanted to thank you for saving my colleagues on Flight 847, and I'm curious about how military medical training compares to civilian emergency medicine. The skills you demonstrated suggest there might be valuable cross-training opportunities." The conversation revealed that academic professionals were interested in learning from military training methodologies once they understood the sophistication and applicability of military education and experience. But the most meaningful recognition came from Marcus's family, who had been aboard Flight 847 and experienced our emergency landing firsthand. "Captain Mitchell, we can never adequately thank you for what you did," Marcus's mother said during the wedding reception. "Our entire family owes you our lives, and we want you to know that we've gained tremendous respect for military service and the people who choose to serve their country." The wedding celebration became an opportunity for education about military careers and recognition of service members' contributions to society in ways that extended far beyond national defense. 6 months later, I'm still serving as an Air Force captain, but my relationship with my family has fundamentally changed in ways that extend far beyond our emergency landing experience. My parents regularly ask about my military assignments and express genuine interest in my professional development and achievements. Emma has become one of my strongest supporters, frequently defending military service when academic colleagues make dismissive comments about service members' intellectual capabilities or career prospects. People need to understand that military training develops problem-solving skills and leadership capabilities that complement academic education rather than competing with it, she told me during a recent conversation. I've learned more about crisis management and decision-making from studying your emergency landing than from most of my graduate coursework. The airline's offer of commercial pilot training remains open, and I've begun considering post-military career options that would allow me to continue flying while transitioning to civilian aviation. The skills that military service developed are increasingly recognized by civilian employers as valuable and transferable to commercial applications. Most importantly, I've learned that family recognition sometimes requires dramatic demonstrations of capability, but genuine respect comes from understanding and appreciating different types of achievement even when they don't align with personal preferences or expectations. The flight that began with cruel mockery of my military career ended with 300 people alive because of exactly the training and experience my family had been dismissing as worthless. Have you ever been underestimated by family members who didn't understand the value of your chosen career path? Sometimes the people closest to us are the last to recognize our true capabilities, especially when our achievements don't fit their expectations for what success should look like. What would you have done in my situation during those 2 hours of public humiliation? Would you have confronted Emma immediately, or would you have stayed quiet like I did until the emergency forced everyone to see my skills in action? I'm curious about your thoughts on family dynamics and professional recognition, especially when it comes to careers that family members don't understand or respect. The hardest part of this experience wasn't managing the emergency landing, it was years of family gatherings where my military achievements were minimized while Emma's academic success was celebrated. Sometimes it takes a crisis to force people to recognize capabilities they've been overlooking, but ideally, family members would appreciate different types of success without requiring dramatic proof. If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and share your own experiences with family members who underestimated your professional skills or dismissed your career choices in the comments. Have you ever had to prove your worth in dramatic ways before family members recognized your capabilities? Your stories help others who might be dealing with similar lack of recognition from people who should be their biggest supporters. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories about family dynamics, unexpected heroism, and the complex relationships between siblings with different career paths and achievements. Ring that notification bell so you never miss updates about military service stories, emergency situations, and learning to value different types of professional excellence. Please share this video with anyone who needs to hear that your career choices have value regardless of whether family members understand or appreciate them. Sometimes the skills that others dismiss as unimpressive turn out to be exactly what's needed when life or death situations arise. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, your professional achievements have value independent of family recognition or approval. The training you receive, the skills you develop, and the service you provide matter regardless of whether the people closest to you understand their importance. Until next time, keep believing in your chosen path, keep developing your capabilities, and keep serving others through whatever profession allows you to make your best contribution. The family members who mock your career today might be the ones whose lives you save tomorrow.